This video is a brief introduction to the Starship launch vehicle under development by SpaceX. Starship is significant because it's one of the launch vehicles that will take mankind back to the moon and on to Mars. Starship is exceptional for many reasons. One of those reasons is its ability to lift a large amount of mass to low Earth orbit and on to the moon and Mars. Let's get a feel for just how capable Starship is by comparing it to other launch vehicles, both historical and operational. Let's do this by reviewing the 4 classifications of launch vehicles by mass to low Earth orbit. The 4 classifications are small, medium, heavy, and super heavy lift. And as a reminder, low Earth orbit is any orbit below 2,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Let's start out with the lightest class of launch vehicle. The lightest class is called small lift, which is any launch vehicle that can place up to 2,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit. 2 historic examples of small lift rockets are the Sputnik and Mercury Atlas. The Sputnik rocket is famous for the 1957 launch of the first artificial satellite in low Earth orbit called Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 spooked the American psyche and initiated the space race between the US and the Soviet Union, culminating in the Apollo program landing men on the moon. Given Sputnik's 1,300 kilogram max payload, it would take 166 Sputnik launches to equal 1 Starship launch. Another historic small lift rocket is the Mercury Atlas, famous for launching the first U.S. astronaut to orbit the Earth. John Glenn rode into space in the Mercury spacecraft he named Friendship 7. The flight occurred on February 20th, 1962, and it marked the first crewed American orbital spaceflight that lasted for almost 5 hours with 3 complete orbits. Given Atlas's max payload of 1,360 kilograms, it would take 162 Atlas launches to equal 1 Starship launch. 2 currently operational examples of small lift rockets are the Electron and Alpha rockets, both in the small satellite launch market. The Electron rocket is built by Rocket Lab, a U.S. company with a New Zealand subsidiary, which can lift 300 kilograms to low Earth orbit for about $7.5 million per launch. The Alpha rocket, built by Firefly Aerospace, is considerably bigger than the Electron, with a lift capacity to low Earth orbit of 1,030 kilograms at a cost of between $15 and $17 million per launch. Again, both have their niche in the booming small satellite launch market. It would take 733 Electron launches and 214 Alpha launches to equal 1 Starship launch based on payload mass. The next class of launch vehicle is the medium lift, with the capacity to put between 2 and 20,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit. 2 historic examples of medium lift rockets are the Vostok and Gemini Titan. The Vostok is a Soviet rocket famous for taking the first man into orbit on the 12th of April 1961. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin circled the Earth once before ejecting from his spacecraft at 23,000 feet, parachuting to the ground. Given the max lift of 4,730 kilograms, it would take 47 launches of the Vostok to equal 1 launch of Starship. Next is the Gemini Titan rocket, which was crucial for the development of the Apollo program. The Apollo program required the docking of the command module and lunar module in low Earth orbit, and this procedure was tested and perfected during the Gemini program. The Titan rocket has a maximum lift of 7,900 kilograms, which would require the equivalent of 28 launches to match Starship. Let's check out a modern example of a medium-lift launch vehicle, which is the hugely successful Falcon 9 rocket. The Falcon 9 has launched 296 times as of this video, with a max payload to LEO of 18,400 kilograms in a partially reusable configuration. This configuration would require 12 launches to equal one Starship launch. Another operational medium-lift rocket is China's Long March 2. The Long March 2F is China's only crew-rated launch vehicle, which has been instrumental in the building of their Tiangong space station. At a max lift capacity of 8,400 kilograms, 26 launches of the Long March 2 would be required to equal one Starship launch. The third class of launch vehicle is the heavy lift, which can put between 20 and 50,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit. An historic example of this class of rocket was the Saturn 1B, which was integral for the Apollo program because it had enough power to put the command, service, and landing modules into low Earth orbit for testing before the Saturn V was ready for flight, thereby speeding up the Apollo program. The Saturn 1B could put 21,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit, necessitating 11 launches to equal Starship. The Space Shuttle is another example of a heavy lift launch vehicle being responsible for the International Space Station, the Hubble Space Telescope, and many other important payloads. The shuttle launched 135 times between 1981 and 2011 and could lift 27,500 kilograms to low Earth orbit, requiring 8 launches to equal Starship. A good example of an operational heavy lift rocket is the Falcon Heavy, powered by 28 Merlin engines. As of this video, there have only been 9 launches of the Falcon Heavy. Falcon Heavy has the second highest payload capacity of any operational rocket behind NASA's Space Launch System. Even though Falcon Heavy can lift 64,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, its heaviest payload was the 9,200 kilogram EchoStar satellite to geosynchronous orbit. Heavy and super heavy payloads are very rare. In fact, Falcon Heavy has not launched any heavy or super heavy payloads yet. At 64,000 kilograms, it would take 3.4 Falcon Heavy launches to equal one Starship launch. Vulcan Centaur is another example of an operational heavy lift launch vehicle. Developed by United Launch Alliance to replace their Atlas V and Delta IV heavy rockets. Its first launch on January 8, 2024 was flawless. Unfortunately, the Peregrine moonlander developed a propellant leak and won't be able to land on the moon. Vulcan Centaur's max payload to LEO is 27,200 kilograms, requiring 8 launches to equal one Starship launch. The fourth and final classification is Super Heavy. This class is capable of lifting payloads over 50,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. A historic example of Super Heavy is the Energia rocket that was built for the Buran space program, the Soviets' answer to the U.S. Space Shuttle. The first Energia mission launched the Polyus, an orbital weapons platform, but failed to reach orbit. The second launched the Buran shuttle for its one and only trip into space, because the Buran was canceled shortly thereafter due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and loss of funding. Energia could lift 100,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, requiring over 2 launches to equal Starship. The Saturn V is by far the most famous super heavy lift launch vehicle with 6 successful moon missions under its belt. Flown between 1967 and 1972, it is the only launch vehicle in history to take humans beyond low Earth orbit. The Saturn V holds the record for the heaviest payload to low Earth orbit of 141,136 kilograms, or 311,152 pounds. the equivalent of 78 Tesla Model S cars. 1.5 launches of the Saturn V would equal 1 Starship launch. An operational example of a Super Heavy launch vehicle is SLS, or Space Launch System, an American-made launch vehicle designed for the Artemis program, which will take humans back to lunar orbit. SLS will launch the crewed Orion spacecraft to lunar orbit, where it will rendezvous with the upper stage of Starship, HLS, for the trip to the surface of the moon and back. SLS can lift 95,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, which is 43% of the 220,000 kilograms of Starship, requiring over 2.3 launches of SLS to equal 1 Starship launch. So as we can see from all these comparisons, Starship is truly exceptional. It is also interesting to note just how rare super heavy payloads are. Of the over 15,000 total payloads that have been launched from Earth, only 15 of them have been super heavy payloads. 12 of those payloads were from the Apollo program. 2 were Energia payloads, and 1 was the Artemis 1 mission launched in 2022. Starship's first payload will only be the 16th super heavy payload ever launched in human history. Now let's take a look at the dimensions of Starship, starting with the Super Heavy booster, or Stage 1. The length of the booster is 71 meters, or 233 feet, and the diameter is 9 meters, or 30 feet. For comparison purposes, let's go with the Boeing 747. Many of us have flown in a 747, and there are at least 6 versions of the Super Jumbo. But let's go with the most modern and largest version, which is the 747-8. The 747-8 first flew in 2010 and has a typical seating capacity of 467. The Dash 8 has a length of 76 meters, or 250 feet, which is only 5 meters, or 16 feet longer than the Super Heavy booster. Let's continue our comparison with the 747. But this time let's compare mass. And here you will get a better picture of just how heavy a fully fueled booster is in comparison to a Dash 8. As you can see from the chart, the empty weight of the booster and Dash 8 are very similar. An empty Dash 8 is only slightly heavier than an empty booster, but a fully fueled booster is 8 times the mass of a fully loaded Dash 8. This is a graphic example of the tyranny of the rocket equation, where 95% of the mass of a rocket is fuel, and even a small increase in payload requires a disproportionate increase in fuel, rocket size, and complexity. Now let's get a feel for how big the second stage of Starship is by comparing it to a Boeing 737. Most of us have flown in a 737 and have a pretty good understanding of its size. But as with the 747, there are a lot of versions of the 737. I chose to go with the largest and most modern version of the 737, which is the 737 MAX 10. The 737 MAX 10 first flew in 2016 and has a max seating capacity of 230. Now let's compare the Starship spacecraft to the MAX 10. Starship is 50 meters, or 164 feet long, and 9 meters, or 30 feet wide. The MAX 10 is 44 meters, or 144 feet long, so by comparison, Starship is 6 meters, or 20 feet longer than the MAX 10. Now let's compare the mass of Starship to that of the MAX 10. And as with the booster, you might be surprised just how heavy a fully fueled Starship is compared to a fully loaded MAX 10. Starship's empty mass is about 100 tons, while the MAX 10 is 48 tons, making Starship's empty mass twice as heavy as the MAX 10. A fully fueled Starship is 1,300 tons, while a fully loaded MAX 10 is 90 tons, making Starship 14 times more massive than the MAX 10. But this is just another example of the fact that the fuel makes up about 95% of the total rocket mass. Now let's check out the payload capacity for Starship. The purpose of Starship, like any other spacecraft, is to carry a useful payload, and Starship shines with its payload capacity and volume. Starship's payload capacity is estimated to be between 150 and 220 tons, and its volume is estimated to be around 1,000 cubic meters. By comparison, the pressurized volume of the International Space Station is 900 cubic meters, or 90% of a single Starship. Also, the total cargo volume of a 747-8 is 874 cubic meters, or 87.4% of Starship. But what is really revealing is a comparison of Starship's volume to the volume of traditional spacecraft, like the Apollo Command Module, the Orion spacecraft, and SpaceX's Crew Dragon. The Apollo Command Module that flew 3 astronauts to the moon at a time had a volume of 6 cubic meters. The Orion spacecraft, which is designed to carry 4 crew to lunar orbit, is a little roomier at 9 cubic meters. Incidentally, the first crewed flight for Orion is Artemis II, scheduled for September 2025. SpaceX's Crew Dragon, which has already carried 46 people to the ISS as of the date of this video, is a little roomier at 9.3 cubic meters. But none of these 3 traditional spacecraft have even 1% of the volume of a single Starship. So what will SpaceX do with all this volume? Well, I think that's just limited by the imagination of scientists and engineers. But you can easily imagine the massive cargo requirements of a small Mars crew of just 3 to 6 people. You would also need multiple cargo starships pre-positioned on Mars before the arrival of the crew. While a small crew of 3 to 6 people would be typical for initial Mars missions, Elon Musk has stated that up to 100 people could be transported to Mars in a single Starship. So while transporting a crew of 100 people to Mars might be a few decades away, later this year or early 2025, we should see the first payload of Starlink satellites delivered to low Earth orbit by Starship. I will go into more detail later in this video regarding the different versions of Starship, including the Starship that will deploy Starlink satellites like a Pez dispenser. Now let's take a look at where Starship is being built and launched. I have created another video detailing all the SpaceX facilities, and I have put a link in the description if you want to check it out. This video won't cover all the facilities like the other one does. Instead, this video will only focus on Starship facilities. Let's start with the build site at Boca Chica, Texas. The build site is essentially composed of 3 sections: the Star Factory, the bays, and the Sanchez site, which includes the rocket garden. The Starship Super Heavy booster is primarily built in the 2 megabays, while the Starship second stage is primarily built in the high bay, but there is some interchange of stages between the bays based on need. The Star Factory is where the rings and nose cones are fabricated. The high bay and 2 megabays are where the ring sections and nose cones are welded together, and also where the Raptor engines are installed. I will save a detailed look at the amazing Raptor engine for a future video. But 33 Raptors power the booster and 6 Raptors power the second stage, 3 of which are vacuum-optimized Raptors identified by their bigger nozzles. Sanchez is the area where ground support equipment like stands are stored while not in use, and the rocket garden is where SpaceX stores both stages of Starship that are in various states of assembly. Testing of Starship and its components will now occur at Massey's test site, located about 4.5 miles west of the build site on the banks of the Rio Grande River. Massey's is now slated to perform static fire, cryogenic, and spin prime tests, where the tanks, piping, and ground service equipment have been installed. It's unclear if SpaceX will move all testing to Massey's, or if some will continue to be performed at the suborbital and orbital launch pads at the launch site, where we are going next. The launch site at Boca Chica is located 2 miles to the east of the build site. So far, SpaceX has made 2 integrated test flights from this pad in 2023, and the much anticipated 3rd test launch is expected sometime in February of 2024. As of now, only 1 integrated launch tower exists, but SpaceX already has some of the components for the 2nd tower ready for install. The black tower shown here has yet to be built. SpaceX needs 2 launch towers to keep up with the anticipated rapid cadence of launches in support of Artemis and other missions. Elon Musk predicts at least 8 launches are required to refuel 1 Starship lunar lander in low Earth orbit before the trip to the moon, which means very quick launches and landings are required, hence the eventual 2nd tower. Starship will also launch from Florida. A Starship integrated launch tower is almost complete near Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. Launch Complex 39A also launches the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. SpaceX can launch crewed, satellite, and cargo missions from here. When the need eventually arises, there will likely be other Starship launch pads built nearby, possibly north of LC-39B at Kennedy Space Center at a site called LC-49. Now let's head on over to the Roberts Road facility, also built on Kennedy Space Center property, located about 3 miles southwest of the massive vehicle assembly building, famous for the Apollo and Space Shuttle programs. SpaceX has built a Starship production factory at their Roberts Road facility just west of Hangar X, where Falcon 9 booster refurbishment takes place. This facility will function just like the build site at Boca Chica with a Starship factory, vertical bays, and rocket garden. Now that we know where Starship is built, let's take a look at how Starship is built. The build process starts with stainless steel rings, 9 meters in diameter and approximately 1.8 meters high, that are fabricated and welded into ring stacks in the Star Factory. Let's take a look at the pros and cons of stainless steel. It isn't as light as aluminum or carbon fiber, but it has the advantage of being stronger, cheaper, easier to work with, and more temperature resistant. Starship needs to go through large temperature fluctuation as it travels at very high speeds through the atmosphere during launches and landings, and needs to do it over and over again. SpaceX plans to build thousands of these ships, so the build process needs to be as easy and efficient as possible. 33 Raptors power the Super Heavy booster, and 6 Raptors power the 2nd stage. The 3 sea-level Raptors with smaller nozzles are gimbalable, which means they help steer Starship. 3 non-gimbalable vacuum-optimized Raptors are easy to spot because of their large nozzles. The 2 forward and 2 aft flaps will help steer Starship as it re-enters the atmosphere. Thousands of hexagonal ceramic tiles are added to the windward side of Starship for thermal protection that are similar in concept to the tiles on the Space Shuttle. The ceramic tiles are necessary because temperatures can reach as high as 1400 Celsius or 2500 degrees Fahrenheit during re-entry. Elon Musk wants to build thousands of Starships within the next couple of decades to meet his goal of a permanent human colony on Mars. There are 4 basic variants of Starship: crewed, cargo, tanker, and satellite payload. The first variant to become operational will likely be the satellite payload version, and the first payload will likely be Starlink satellites, with other commercial payloads to follow shortly thereafter, especially in a rideshare configuration. The PEZ dispenser satellite deployment method will deploy racks of satellites through a door reminiscent of the beloved PEZ candy dispenser. The crewed lunar lander called HLS, or Human Landing System, needs to be developed rather quickly in light of the Artemis 3 mission, scheduled for September 2026, which will land humans on the moon for the first time since the Apollo program. HLS needs to be human-rated by NASA well before the 2026 deadline, so SpaceX is in a real crunch time to get HLS developed, tested, and certified. HLS will dock with the Orion spacecraft in lunar orbit and transfer astronauts to the surface of the moon near the South Pole. But before HLS can land on the moon, it needs to get there. Starship needs to be refueled at least 8 times in low Earth orbit before it can begin TLI, or translunar injection. The tankers will dock with HLS in low Earth orbit and transfer the cryogenic methane and oxygen fuel to HLS, and this needs to be done in a timely manner that minimizes cryogenic fuel boil-off. Now let's examine the cargo version. Multiple cargo variants need to be built for every crewed version of Starship. Cargo variants will likely be pre-positioned on most moon missions and all Mars missions before crew arrives. Also, given the size of Starship, it's easy to imagine multiple units linked together and used as habitation and cargo modules, forming a base on the moon and Mars. The acceleration of commercial space programs and the planned manned missions in conjunction with NASA is really exciting, and I for one can't wait to follow along with the progress towards those goals. So in summary, we have compared historical and operational rockets to Starship, getting a good idea of its exceptional nature. We also compared its size and mass to the Boeing 747 and 737, and maybe surprised a few of you with its huge mass. We looked at where Starship is being built and launched, and we also looked at how Starship is being built and its different variants. I hope you liked this video. I will be making more SpaceX and space-related videos in the future, so subscribe if you like this video and want to see more. Thanks for watching.